All right, thanks everyone for joining us here in the after lunch graveyard shift. We'll try and keep things entertaining and exciting for you. I'll do a brief introduction of the guys here and check out everyone's bios in the app. I think that's the easiest way to learn about everybody. We've got Nick Davis here from Memery, Crystal. We've got Will Gibbs from Octopus Ventures. We've got Sean Stiefel from Navy Capital, and down the end we've got Oppermann from Shimadzu. So welcome everybody, and I guess a gear shift for cannabis in Europe when the theme of this conversation came through. My initial thought was a gear shift, and I couldn't figure if it was up or down, and then I realised it's probably more of a handbrake, I think, that we've seen in the last 12 months. And apologies to everybody, this may not get off to the most buoyant, optimistic start, this discussion, but we'll certainly get there towards the end, I promise. But I want to start with Nick. You're an expert in this arena about finding money for companies.
Yeah.
Is the money even there anymore?
It's nice to be back. Which gear are we in? Probably neutral.
Are we rolling down the hill though?
Yeah, probably.
Backwards or forwards?
Neutral. We'll stay neutral. Look, I think I sat here pre-pandemic in the first one of these, and full of optimism, full of a real belief that this market was going to take off in the public markets, and it hasn't to a greater extent. We're still seeing money privately. There are still investors, there are still family offices, there are still the odd fund that's still around and still investing. And I'm still positive, because otherwise I wouldn't be here. But it's definitely been a year of standing pretty still. In fact, when I spoke here a year ago, I didn't think we'd be sitting here where we are. Now that's probably a UK perspective, but I think it's probably a European perspective, because that's the markets that have funded these companies in the public space have been London to a greater or lesser extent. So is there money? Probably. Where is it? Hard to find. Can great companies raise money? Of course they can.
And Will, from your perspective as well, with Octopus Ventures, you guys invest heavily in health, and this is certainly one of your areas of focus, has been for a while. How are you finding it in terms of investment, the money flow that's coming in, the money that's there or around, and the investor appetite for, cannabis-related companies?
So I'd say that all of my outlook is 100% from a health perspective versus recreational. But I would say that even from a medicinal perspective, that's still a very specialist subset of investors, typically those that are coming from a kind of bio or pharma perspective, where they're more literate in peer-reviewed journals and quantitative studies versus social taboo and prevailing norms. And so whilst it can be a conservative community in many ways, I do think that it is a community that is open to at least being challenged in very specific ways, whether that's through peer-reviewed journals or the like. And so I do think that means that actually investors that come from a health perspective are probably more active. I think a proxy for me is probably some of the US bio investors investing in psychedelics increasingly, whereas before that was just purely a kind of family office play. So seeing people like RA Capital and teams that typically only invest in single molecule pharma oncology treatments take this space seriously. So I see that as a growth area in terms of investor profile. But I would say that even cannabis aside, like more from a generalist fund and investing perspective, like we invest in probably about 40 new companies a year and have about 150 existing portfolio companies. But the consumer companies are finding it most challenging today to raise money. And there's a particular premium on companies with recurring revenues, with high revenue forecastability that sell into businesses. And so I think companies that resemble more software or infrastructure will have quite a different story to tell versus consumer brand businesses, where these businesses often are valued at 1 to 2x revenues versus software or infrastructure where it might be more like 5 to 10.
In the last 12 to 18 months, maybe even a bit longer, if you haven't been profitable or if you haven't had at least enough cash to give you about a 5-year runway, it seems, no one wants to put money near you. Sean, in your experience, are you seeing that the way that you look at companies in this sector has radically changed because of just the general market conditions?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things to highlight. I've been investing in cannabis for 7 years and have seen multiple cycles kind of through this. I think the biggest detriment in both the US, which is our primary focus, in Europe, is just the lack of regulatory clarity. And so even if you believe someone's business model will hold up, you have no idea on the timing or the duration. And so any long duration asset in this world is getting punished given interest rates. But in this one in particular, I think looking at Europe, and we have some investments in Europe, the way Germany has still sort of not really put forward clear regulations reminds people of what's going on in the US. It's not going to take a lot to get the sector excited again. Most of the US run from when Biden was elected to kind of early 2021 was really driven by $1 to $2 billion of total invested capital. So you're not talking about big numbers to really get big returns. I would say the flip side of all of this is in the last 2 years, you have seen business models just not work. And I think the Europeans would be wise to look at what's gone on in America, where subscale operators basically are all going out of business. And I think if you look and say, hey, you know, this industry probably shouldn't support 10,000 companies per country, it's probably going to be closer to 10. Those are pretty valuable lessons as an investor. You want to see a business model that can scale profitably, which, you know, the U.S., in my opinion, even though we're quite far from full regulatory reform, you can take a lot of lessons as to kind of what's not working and apply it to the European market.
Off the back of that, do you see that this space is now ripe in the conditions that it's in for a lot of consolidation? A lot of those companies that are failing are just going to get snaffled up by the stronger players.
I actually, in any other industry, the answer would be yes. In this industry, I think what you see are nobody wants to acquire these businesses, in the US at least, because it's very hard to transfer licenses at a minimum, and a lot of their facilities and their locations are obsolete. And so you're almost better off right now just doing it yourself. Let them go out of business, find something similar. We're not particularly bullish on consolidation for those reasons. We think it's, you know, the best operators in the US, the biggest guys generally, they can do this all themselves. They don't need to go rescue somebody. And certainly given where everybody's multiples are, which is kind of 4 to 5 times EBITDA, there's nothing out there that's really accretive if you have to then put any sort of real money behind it.
The regulation piece and legislation and controls and this entire industry, it always seems to be a roadblock to a lot of capital flow into this sector. It's not saying that the capital's not there, but it certainly seems to be a drag on that. Uwe, in your experience from a regulatory side of things, how have you seen the industry shape and change from your perspective in Europe and Germany, of course?
The market, as you know, is impacted from many expected and unexpected factors right now. But cannabis and legalization is always a hot topic discussion. Germany, as everybody expected, should have been one of the driving forces, especially when governmental change has been performed and the green parties have been now possible to impact somehow in politics. Our Federal Minister of Health, Professor Karl Lauterbach, he has been quite pushy for cannabis legalization. Since quite a while he is very active in that field, but as you most probably all know, as long as politics is involved, things are moving a little bit more slow. And in the beginning, you already pointed out, we expected a kind of gear shift, and it looks like sometimes more we are driving with a handbrake. This is of course clear and against everybody's expectation. We have been here in the forum since many years, and I can remember very well, since the beginning we are talking about these kind of things, legalization, and I can say really in Germany we have been very optimistic that things are moving in the right direction, but as I said, still slow. Karl Lauterbach, he wanted now to implement the Spanish way, yeah, for recreational cannabis consumption, use these kind of social clubs, or start a kind of distribution network in so-called coffee shops like we know from the Netherlands since a long time. So there is many approach, and the legalization of 25 grams cannabis per person, that sounds great in the beginning, but the question is when really we are ready to implement this to the market. Yeah? It looks like if you listen in the news or if you're reading actual interviews, we are very close, but let's say, frankly speaking, we as a instrument manufacturer for providing analytical instrument to the industry, to the control labs, to the growers, just to take care on the required quality of your products. We are monitoring this situation since many years. And of course, in the very beginning, we had the feeling things are really moving forward. But in the last 3 years, it looks like we are tracking back instead of forward. So we have many contacts in the industries where the indication to start now, yeah, for growing in big quantities, that is still in a hindering phase. Yeah.
It feels like there's a lot of kind of bashing your head against the wall kind of momentum with this industry at the moment, because the political side of things is so uncertain, and that if there's anything that investors hate, it's uncertainty, especially when it's, you know, comes to allocating their money. And I had a bit of a quick scroll through the app, and there's no one from Euroclear, funnily enough, here today. But when a massive custodian like Euroclear comes out and says retail investors can't hold cannabis stocks in their investment accounts, what kind of message does that send to the market about this industry and the uncertainties that are involved in? Anyone can chip in with an answer to this. Look, is there going to be change, or is that just another major setback to the attitudes towards this industry?
Look, the Home Office in the UK could help with this very quickly. You know, Jersey has clarified the Proceeds of Crime Act, and yeah, it wasn't a particularly complicated thing to do. When you talk to the Home Office, when we file suspicious activity reports, which those of you who've tried to do business in the UK will understand, you never get a no. Sometimes you don't get a response at all. Sometimes you get a thank you for sending. So not only have you got uncertainty around the plant, which, yeah, in most countries I think is the key problem. In the UK, you've got this Proceeds of Crime Act issue, which the Home Office are aware of. Yeah, we ended up getting quite aggressive when we listed MGC Pharmaceutical, which was the first listed cannabis company in the UK, because we were stuck at the FCA, who in turn were stuck at the Home Office, and we got this flurry of guidance that we managed to generate by, excuse me, I have a cold, in May in England. Yeah, we had a flurry of activity, and then it stopped again. So until we get some clarity around that, and then when Euroclear decide pretty much unilaterally, from what I can see, and with no notice, to say, we're closing your accounts, you know, if you're an investor in 2023 allocating, as you said, we're back to widgets. We're back to old-fashioned industries is a bit strong, but those industries which are as risk-off as possible. And unfortunately, over the last 4 years, we're probably more risk-on with cannabis than we've ever been. From a governmental, you've got elections in the UK, you've got elections coming up in the States. You had the elections in Germany that we thought were landmark, which may turn out to be, but as we sit here today, haven't delivered. So you've got to be a pretty frontier investor to take on all of those risks at the moment. I still believe the returns will be there, but the timing is just so uncertain that it's pretty difficult at the moment.
Will, your thoughts on that? Do you see this as this sort of, I don't want to use the word crisis, it gets used too much, but this period of time as a more of an opportunity in this market, if you really think about how this does progress long term?
Yeah, so for us as a team, like we came to the world of cannabis and psychedelics through a broader thesis around like investing in taboo areas within health. So areas that make people blush to talk about typically hints at institutionalized bias and very low levels of innovation, but very high latent demand. So when we invested in LV, the silent breast pump, like the biggest risk in us investing in that business was, even if they were wildly successful, would anyone else put any money into that business? Or when we invested in Quit Genius in substance addiction, or Lavender doing LGBT sexual health, like the biggest risk is not does the company perform, but will there be other investors to invest at the later stages? And seeing that play out has been quite interesting, where it's actually taken investors to miss out on objective commercial opportunities to rethink their views and biases. And so lots of people looked at LV when they first had a Kegel exercise trainer dealing with urinary incontinence for women, and the breast pump, and was just like, this is a joke, this isn't a business. But when that business is doing 100 million plus in revenue, and like the partners in those funds are getting beaten up by their LPs of like, well, why didn't you invest in this? And the excuse is, well, it's a bit weird and like it made us blush. Like that isn't good enough. So unfortunately, it is probably going to take a number of very successful cannabis businesses to go through the market for people to say no, and then for people to be beaten up for why they didn't invest it, to actually kind of warm a lot of these folks up, so it doesn't just become a kind of investment area for specialist funds.
What do you think, Sean? Are those companies there? Are they there for the taking out in the market at the moment?
I'll throw three things at you. Again, I believe we're the largest hedge fund in cannabis, so I probably have more experience in this than anybody else. But three interesting facts. Liquidity in terms of the volume and dollars traded for the US operators is the lowest it's ever been. I think it's the most difficult it's ever been for somebody, a fund or a retail trader, to wake up and say they want to buy any one of these stocks. More and more banks have shut down the ability to do so. And I also believe that there's the fewest number of interesting investable companies that there's ever been in cannabis. So, you know, those three things combined have created a dynamic where you can look at the 10 biggest US operators that are publicly traded, and there are days by noon where there's not even $1 million of volume across the entire 10. So you've got a setup, though, which is actually quite interesting because, again, it kind of, as I said earlier, it will not take a lot to get this going. And to Will's point, the biggest kind of dictator of sentiment is price. Once this starts going higher, there will be more money. This has always been a FOMO sector. I believe it will continue to be a FOMO sector. And, you know, we've been fortunate in that we've built long-standing relationships with our investor base, and they understand what's going on, and we actively are deploying into this low liquidity environment. Could things go down more? Absolutely. But, you know, I do believe that it's not going to take much to get it going. That being said, you know, this environment is such that a lot of these companies face binary outcomes. And, you know, you certainly see that with the number of sub $1 stocks kind of that are listed. So you can deduce a lot from that, but I would say to you that in general, this is the worst environment from actually being an investor but that should also create sizable opportunity on the back end.
Yeah, I did promise this wouldn't be the most optimistic start to this session, but we'll get there, I promise, we'll get there. Uwe, you come from, as you say, it's more of a hardware side of things with the work that you do at Shimadzu. Is that, do you think that that's where this, the spark might just light the industry up again? And Will mentioned it before around infrastructure and things like that. Is that where you see the resurgence coming from in the cannabis sector?
Yeah, that's right. As I said, we try to make complicated things easy. Yeah, as you know, the manufacturers, they have to take care about the good quality of the product. And if you start talking with people in the field, usually they are a little bit afraid of, oh, can I do the cannabis testing by myself? Can I do the product evaluation by myself? We are there to help. So we bring in the analytical instrument as a basic. What everybody want to know is usually the CBDs and the THC. So with this kind of profiling or potency testing, that is some of the small system configurations we can provide to the beginners. But with these small tools for the beginners, we bring in the know-how and we don't leave anybody alone. So once you have a clear understanding of what needs to be done, what is the value of your product, the things starting moving, and the growers later on can decide whether that is the type of analytical equipment they want to use for the routine, or even in the second step, have a closer look to the contaminants. Yeah, we are talking about contaminants like mycotoxins, pesticides, heavy metals. So this is the same type of evaluation from point of view of quality control as you have in the food sector, as you have in the pharma sector. This is just the basic things, the basic tools for make sure the product is ready to be in the market. Yeah. So this is some, let's say, investment which need to be done. And talking about investment, I can tell you we are again talking about the handbrake, but in some sectors we see investment. Yeah? In my hometown, just 6 weeks ago, the biggest German cannabis warehouse has been installed. Yeah? They are storing more than 50 tons of cannabis in an area of 1,200 square meters. Yeah, it's a high security storage location like the Bank of England. But this is mainly supplies to the pharmaceutical industries. Of course, products will be stored there after passing the proper quality control and then distributed to all the pharmaceutical industries. And why did they do it now? Because the market expect we are close before legalization also to the recreational market. Yeah? So from that point of view, as soon as this is released, the request from the industry, yeah, and all of these recreational products, talking about products for smoking, drinking, or eating, we will be prepared. And we will be prepared also to guarantee for the tools for the quality control.
We've all mentioned it a little bit here, is that tipping point to change, to get things going again, doesn't take much to get things fired up again. Sean, you mentioned it, it's a FOMO area for investment. And it certainly feels like, I concur with you, Will, that the medicinal side of things and the health side of things is certainly the core, going to be a core driver. But then you're right, Sean, FOMO drives this, and the sexy part of this from an investment point of view is the recreational stuff, is the, food and drink and, the potential for those. I remember 2 years ago when we were talking about this, and guys were coming up and they wanted to talk about, cannabis drinks getting launched in different places in North America and so forth. that seems to have kind of been shelved for the moment. But how do you balance, and again, anyone can chip in here, how do you balance that idea of, the medicinal side and the health side of things with the FOMO that does get this market sort of sexed up again and get people interested in it?
I'll throw something positive out there. So in the wake of massive price compression that we've seen in the United States to the tune of some markets down 40 to 50% year over year on the price of the same product, you're still seeing revenue growth in those markets. So you're seeing upticks in the volume and the actual consumption of products, which is very encouraging. And we always point to Michigan as sort of like the bellwether here to say the consumer demand is very robust and it's actually growing. What we've seen in the United States is there's this loophole with the Farm Bill that allows you to ship hemp-derived psychoactive ingredients like a Delta-8 or a Delta-9 directly to somebody's door. And that industry has absolutely exploded, which has allowed for kind of a mass marketing, if you will, of kind of psychoactive products. So I'm actually on the board of CAN, which is a cannabis beverage company. We're very bullish on that. We think the less sophisticated consumers, particularly in places like the East Coast and Europe, will gravitate towards that because they don't have the knowledge base that a California consumer
Is
has.
that going to come to Europe though, or is that going to stay as an exclusive part of North America?
It all depends on what the regulations ultimately look like, but we see no reason it shouldn't. I personally believe that at the end of the day, there's a reason you don't smoke any other medicines. And so I think it's just a more efficient format that many people just don't smoke, period. So I think that there's no reason not to offer the consumer something that they're going to want that may or may not be healthier.
What gets this going again? It also, this is Cannabis Europa, and as far as I'm aware, the guys aren't doing a Psychedelics Europa immediately. They may be, I don't know. But it feels like the psilocybin and the psychedelics stuff, the research, the potential medicinal use cases, it's kind of taken a step higher over the cannabis industry at the moment in terms of the sexy thing that people want to invest in and where the capital wants to come. And I know there's a few companies that are listed and on the Aquis Exchange that are in that space. What do you think, Nick? Is psychedelics sort of now leading the race here for the investment capital?
Well, it's interesting. Again, the stock exchange don't really know what to do with it. So we've worked with a number of mainly North American psychedelics companies that are looking at London as a possible listing venue. And we're kind of where we were with cannabis at the start, which is Aquis is, doing a good job. It's open. It's a market that most people haven't heard of, and it's quite a difficult sell to certain investors. I see to my left as to what's going to get this interesting. We're actually working on an IPO at the moment. Yeah, I know. And hopefully if that comes to market in the next 3 or 4 months, which it's due to, and it's well received and people make money, then other deals, and this is just market economics and it's FOMO. If that deal goes well and the 3 others that are sitting quietly on the sidelines going, okay, we're going to do another private round and we're going to keep going, see that even just stays at its issue price for a couple of weeks, that will generate its own momentum. I guess the interesting thing for me is the US is such a mature market now. What opportunities do you see in Europe? You're the guy that's writing the check and the biggest check of all.
Yeah, we have an investment in Sanity Group, for instance. Germany is 80 million people. That's a huge number. We feel that's going to be a great market once you can understand what business models work. It's very possible that regulations make companies entirely obsolete. I think from my perspective, for me to write another big check into Europe, I want to see a live European market that's functional. Because we don't know. I generally believe, so Germany goes, so the rest of Europe will go. But they may do something where it's the existing pharmacies that are the sellers. They may do something where it's these nonprofit clubs that end up sticking like they have in Spain, which seems to be how they're going to start at least. So what we've learned from America is you cannot take anything for granted until the market is up and running. And even then, you don't know what twists and turns the politicians can throw at it, as is evident in New York, which is probably the most dysfunctional market in the world. So my personal view is there's going to be a lot of weed sold on the European continent, and it's just going to be a matter of what business models actually fit the regulatory framework. And for now, we're just guessing, is the truth.
And I think for me, like, we're seeing more and more very talented teams tackle the least glamorous areas, which actually are often the least sexy, but also the least risky. And so whether that is doing compliance software, or whether if that is trying to help existing clinicians, predominantly private clinicians, maybe like rheumatologists seems like an area where there's a lot of interest. How do you help existing clinicians manage risk, insurance, and supply chain? Like that's a lot less sexy than a new direct-to-consumer brand with a novel component or positioning or celebrity ambassador. But do I think investors would go for a vertical specific software play? Yes. And so I do think some of these less risky, less sexy areas, for me, have a large premium at the moment.
And just going back to the psychedelics comparison, what we've always suffered with, particularly in the UK market, is CBD and medical cannabis being thrown into the same bucket, whereas the psychedelic side is clearly medical. So you've got biotech, life sciences investors who are not really interested in the recreational market. They're playing a long-term, GW game. You've got FMCG plays, and we've seen that those have gone up and down, and those are the ones who rush to market. And we're seeing lots of consolidation there. There are some existing brands who are worth saving. Some are being bought out of administration. But until, again, I think it's really difficult to talk about cannabis in the same. If it's medical cannabis and psilocybin, they're competing, I presume, for the same dollar. The CBD plays are competing against Pepsi and Coke and all the other consumer goods brands, which are not favourable in the market at the moment. So we're certainly seeing that whole CBD space is not publicly investable at the moment. The medical side, people are still very interested in. And I don't know.
Yeah, and I think even then, businesses that look more like Ginkgo or biomanufacturing businesses like Octopus and people like that, where you can avoid the need to have glass houses, physical plants. Like that feels like the future if you compare medicinal cannabis to any other API manufacturing process. And I think more and more like very talented biotech academics are getting interested to that manufacturing side, which maybe 2-3 years ago wasn't particularly glamorous, but there is a route to being able to see how you could make tens or hundreds of millions in revenue without massive changes in regulatory frameworks.
I'll push back on that and say, having lost a lot of money in that space, the problem is nobody really has identified what 650 of the cannabinoids do. And so there's really no end market for what these cannabinoids ultimately will do and to serve. Likewise, if your main goal is to just extract the 10 biggest cannabinoid or 10 most well-known, it's cheap enough now that you can do it directly from the plant. And I think one thing that's a big core to our thesis over the long term is that ultimately this industry is going to evolve to look like alcohol in the sense that you've got kind of, making this number up, a 10 to 20 large conglomerates, a bunch of craft guys, a bunch of regional guys, but certainly not hundreds and thousands of companies. And so if you're building a business that's reliant upon an addressable market growing, I would make the argument that at least in the United States, from now until the end of time, there's going to be fewer cannabis companies. We see that, in California, for instance, the number of licenses is down almost 50% year over year. We just think the market has to get to the point where the marginal producer can't enter the market easily, same way we can't all decide we're going to make a gin and get into real distribution.
There's plenty of gin companies out there, though. All right, as we sort of wrap up towards the end of this session, I want to give you all a chance to, what is your optimistic take on this market? I mean, it's clear we're all sat here because we do believe in the long-term value of this as an opportunity for investors, as an industry to grow, whether it be medicinal, recreational, hardware, software, everything else in between. From your own perspectives, what is the thing that gets you most excited from an investment point of view in this market that you see as a really great opportunity at this point? We'll start with you down the end, Uwe.
Yeah, that would be really great to see some light in the European economy. And I'm sure as soon as investment, like we have seen in the big cannabis warehouse, if this investment is increasing in field of, as we heard, pharmaceutical, medical and recreational cannabis, I believe this will really a great and a nice impact for Europe. And I believe, as in the United States, we see the market has been starting as for sure earlier than us. Yeah, we are here in Europe a kind of follower market. But when things are moving forward as we expect, and if I could, let's say, have a wish free, then I would think about coming back to the headline of our discussion. That could really result in a kind of gear shift for the next future.
What
But
about you?
of course, we
Sorry.
need also the politicians to move a little bit more fast.
You've cashed out all your wishes, so the politician thing's not happening. What about you, Sean? What's the thing that really excites you about this industry?
I still believe that the U.S. will get to a $100 billion market in relatively short order. And in this scenario that we're in today, where there is fewer competition because people are going out of business left and right, and you're starting to see momentum around the regulatory side of things, whether it's kind of the Deep South Republican states or Washington itself, I believe the field is quite narrow with quite a large opportunity ahead of it. The biggest companies in America are about $1 billion market cap. If you just back of the envelope math, if you think it's a $100 billion industry, that's crazy. So we think there's a lot of upside for the guys that are going to make it. And every day it's becoming more and more clear who's going to make it. So that's what gets me excited.
Just hopefully the custodians will allow people to invest as well. Will, what are your thoughts?
So I'm pretty bearish on most direct-to-consumer businesses at the moment. But I do think that clinical areas that cannabinoids look to address are so emotive that you can make a special allowance here. And I think that level of demand means that people will seek the product out despite lots of friction. But I'm still nervous by the cost of and friction to deliver a direct-to-consumer cannabinoid or pain clinic. That previously for me was a really exciting area, but I think for me the last couple of years I've toned that down. But my real interest at the moment is in the infrastructure plays where the science works, and for lots of clinicians in particular verticals where there's a higher tolerance for risk and experimentation, and every clinical area has a very different threshold for that. I think there is enough people there to reach that critical mass to take the friction out of prescribing and anything around clinical management software for me. Sounds dull, but I think there's a big opportunity there in the next 2 to 5 years.
What do you think, Nick?
I go back to why
what's the company that's going to pitch to you next?
Well, I go back to why I got started in this, which is my daughter has a rare autoimmune disease. And, 10 years ago now, we went to all around the world to find something to help her. And you mentioned, rheumatoid arthritis, which is an autoimmune disease. So I'm still a believer. I think we need more clinical evidence. I think that's happening. Telemedicine. I think, as you said, patients, parents of patients, I was one of them, will find whatever they need to help. and the rest will follow. So I'm still bullish on the thesis that this plant helps patients. The recreational side will take care of itself. It's not going to happen in the UK in the near future, and the markets are not going to let it happen in the near future. So we're still very focused. I'm still very focused on helping patients, finding those products that will help patients, and I think finding access to it, telemedicine, technology, software. Those are the sorts of businesses that we're seeing. That if Will says they're the right ones, then I'm in the right space.
Well, considering how hard the tech sector's been smashed over the last 18 months, the fact you guys have both sort of mentioned technology is not a bad way into this. It's quite encouraging, and the fact that an IPO is on the way, fingers crossed, and that there is optimism in this sector and something to look forward to. But that is our time expired. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you guys for your participation.